I grew up in the far western suburbs of Chicago, in an area that used to be probably prairie and woodland, but by the time I lived there had been carved up into subdivisions. And probably in between had been something like a cow pasture. But by the time I lived there, it was dominated by houses and lawns. And in these kinds of suburbs, weeds were considered to be kind of like enemies, right? They were things to be pulled up out of your lawn or poisoned. And sometimes I wondered why that was, because dandelions to me looked like beautiful plants, and they weren't easy to pull up either because of the long root system. And if you're anywhere near my age, if you remember the 1980s, you might also remember an ad campaign put out by our federal government with the theme of just say no to drugs, right? And they had this commercial showing an egg in a frying pan. It said, "This is your brain on drugs," with this image of the egg in a frying pan. And this was meant to represent the impact of these evil agents on the innocent brain. I guess the brain, like the lawn, was supposed to be free of weed. But what is a weed? George Washington Carver famously said that a weed is just a flower that grows in the wrong place. And recently I've been getting much more interested in weeds and what they do. The naturalist David Quammen wrote an article called Planet of Weeds, where he said that weedy species are not just plants, but also animals that share a certain constellation of characteristics. They take hold in strange places. They succeed especially well in disturbed ecosystems, and they resist eradication once they are established. They are scrappers, generalists, and opportunists. And as human beings have altered the planet, Quammen said, fragmenting habitats wherever we tread, the whole world has only gotten weedier, because these are the very species that prosper under the adverse conditions that we create. Botanist Peter de Tredici has said that by looking at these plants as invaders, or thugs as he calls them, it makes it impossible for us to see the positive contributions that they make. And as with weeds, so it is with people. When I was a public health outreach worker in Chicago in the 1990s, I got to know a lot of remarkable people. This gentleman's name was Pierre. He used to push his buggy every single day to gather up items that he could sell to support himself. This was Leonard, and he would shake this cup in the Loop, which is the downtown business district of Chicago, every day to gather change to support himself. And this gentleman, I don't remember his name, but he just went by the name Painter because he was a sign painter. And he worked decorating signs for local businesses, and he slept at night on a worn-out couch in a second-hand store in his neighborhood on the west side of Chicago. And this was Tim and his brother Tahi, who were tireless gatherers of scrap metal. Now, all these individuals could easily just be considered as homeless drug users. And drugs were certainly a part of their lives. Like most people, they used them primarily to feel better or to numb the pain. They made a living where the pickings were thin, though, and I admired them for this, even though their hold in the soil was always a little bit tentative. Too often, their lives ended early. This is Bobby Jean. Bobby Jean passed away about 20 years ago, when he was about the same age that I am now, in a nursing home on Chicago's west side, across the street from the Cook County Jail. He had been a heroin user when he was young, but after getting out of prison, he switched to alcohol, which, by the way, is the most popular destructive drug in our country. He was a humorous street corner philosopher who certainly made his mark on me, but he left hardly a trace on the earth. As a researcher investigating substance use in the 2000s in the rural areas of Ohio, I tried to document the paths leading people of various backgrounds to problematic drug use. In Ohio, I saw opioids starting to seep into the fissures of small towns, feeding off the boredom and the pathos of places left behind by globalization. When I moved to Detroit in 2005, I started doing work here, based here in Dearborn and doing research in Detroit, and I started doing interviews here with dozens of interviews with problem substance users. And their life histories always seem to trace back to the neighborhood environment, the social networks and the degraded landscapes that surrounded them there. But when I went to those neighborhoods and I walked around, I saw something else. I was struck by the natural environments that emerged in Detroit after the white middle class and their markets abandoned it. These scenes have struck many people, leading them to comment that the city had gone back to nature. But this was a bit misleading, because nature, of course, never went away. Nature just filled in the gaps that humans had left behind, like a touch-up artist suddenly allowed to decorate the whole wall. Del Tredici writes that the amount of spontaneous vegetation in a given city is inversely proportional to its economic prosperity, and Detroit is therefore ground zero for weed proliferation. This is often seen as a sign of blight and equated to a destructive disease. But if you look at a field like this, you can also see that this is not an area that's so much blighted as one that's bursting with life. Now, drugs are another unavoidable aspect of these communities, usually defined as problems to be controlled, enemies to be defeated, monsters to be slain or exiled. Like the weed ecology that thrived in these left-behind places, filling in gaps and breaking down structures, individuals remade these spaces through their irrepressible activity. A crack cocaine user can burn through thousands of dollars, $5 or $10 at a time, and make no investment in anything that outlasts the day. In the process, they may also transform and consume their environments. And residents of neighborhoods that have been afflicted by crack cocaine epidemics have compared their cumulative effect to those of a war or a hurricane. These so-called crackheads were also dehumanized people equated to pests or weeds and treated with the same lack of respect. But the militaristic response of law enforcement only heightened the destruction of these communities. And while I would caution us against taking ecological metaphors too far, in other words, comparing people to weeds, because of the places that can lead, I think that the life of the weed and that of the street hustler have certain commonalities: an intensive use of energy, a resourcefulness in the face of diminished means, and also, too often, a short lifespan. But wars on drugs and wars on weeds are also equally pointless. As Johann Hari has written, the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. People in recovery like to say that drugs are not my problem, drugs are my solution. Drugs do not seek out people. People turn to drugs to address issues that they cannot otherwise resolve. Drugs just fill in the gaps in both psyches and in society. Users describe heroin as a warm blanket of comfort, and cocaine as a jolt of bulletproof confidence, feelings that they long for or are lacking otherwise. So laying waste to the terrain with either cops or with chemicals only aggravates the underlying trauma that allows the space for the drugs or the weeds to enter. So how do we move beyond thinking about drugs or weeds as a source of our problems? How do we live with them and learn from them? Today, when I hear people talk about drug-infested neighborhoods or rodent-infested cities, equating drug users or people or weeds to pests or blight, I instead think about their creative potential and their energy and how it might work to our collective benefit if we only understood the complexities of seed and soil better than we do. Turning this lens around would allow us to see these drugs and weeds not as evil or malevolent forces, but as environmental responses and symbolic messengers, ecologically linked to the social wounds left behind by long-term destructive processes such as racial segregation and deindustrialization, cycles of abandonment and despair that had actively remolded the city over decades. Maybe the weeds were pointing us in the direction of a transition, preparing the soil for a fuller recovery. Now, in the city itself, I wasn't the only one that noticed this, of course. As the prisons grew fat and neighborhoods were drained dry, these questions presented themselves to residents on the front lines of this failed war. How do we move from drug dens and prison cells to bike lanes and community gardens? How do we replace weeds and dirt with fruit and flowers? How do we harvest our decades of sorrow for a flourishing future? Where others drove the streets of Detroit and saw only ruins, I began to see these persistent spirits pushing through the pavement everywhere I walked and everywhere I looked. This unexpected connection now drives my own continuing fascination with the weedy side of cities. So as I have journeyed through Detroit over the last decade and a half, I've encountered other types of weedy people, undeterred and inventive survivors, like Carlos Nielbach, who builds windmills and sculptures out of upcycled metal to harvest the city's discarded materials and harness its winds in order to create jobs and to preserve a proud heritage for his city. Or Corey Batty, who began clearing the overgrown alleys in his neighborhood, recovering these abandoned garages because he saw potential for unlocking his neighbor's creativity. Or Karen Knox, who created a beautiful garden on some vacant lots on her block on the east side of Detroit, with the goal of improving residents' lives. These people were seeking not just to survive, to make it through, but they were trying to create conditions where others could thrive in that soil. Now, the prison is another kind of a barren, human-made landscape, where I've been fortunate enough to meet people who have redefined themselves and their conditions. Now, these people, anyone who met them today, would have to wonder how any sane society could insist on denying their creative potential and their freedom for as long as we have. These three men, Carlos Harris, Victor Walker, and Darrell Woods, they all cultivated their talents while in the confines of the Michigan Department of Corrections. Now they're all released, and they are blooming where they have landed, passing on what they have learned. They are converting once barren ground into productive soil that will benefit those who come after. In Detroit, I've also gotten to know some other characters. This one, the wild carrot, also known as Queen Anne's lace. It was once used as a morning-after contraceptive, and now fills the fields of Detroit in early summer. I think you can also buy this for your bouquets some places. One of its common companions is a plant called chicory. Chicory is a plant whose roots can be roasted and added to coffee, as they do in New Orleans in the famous Café du Monde. And then there's a spotted knapweed. It produces chemicals that suppress the growth of nearby plants, contributing to its own success as a colonizer of barren ground. And you might be heartened to know that University of Michigan researchers have shown that the weedy fields of Detroit are a much healthier habitat for bumblebees than the pesticide deserts of suburbia. Jimmy and Grace Lee Boggs of Detroit often refer to their fellow Detroiters as people who know how to make a way out of no way. Ice-T has described the art of rap music as making something out of nothing. Now when I see a tree of heaven, the scientific name is Ailanthus altissima. When I see it bursting out of a doorway, sometimes called a ghetto palm, the Ailanthus altissima. When I see it busting up concrete or rooting in places where you couldn't expect that a plant could grow, clinging to the side of a building, I can't help but see this as a source of inspiration, a crack in the pavement suggesting possibility. So now I think, to paraphrase the famous words of Henry Thoreau, who said, "In wildness is the preservation of the world," maybe we should say instead, and weediness is the salvation of the world.